fine. Okay. All right. Okay. Let's. We'll talk a bit some point, email or something like that. We can plan things together or whatever. Okay. Last week on Thursday, we had Fatty's presentation, a very broad survey of what we're calling pre-Viking, very early Ireland, and then I gave my. It may seem very basic, or it might seem quite detailed, I don't know how it was to you, but survey of the kind of Irish politics and the main kingdoms before the Viking period. Today we'll look at the introduction of Christianity into Ireland, and depending on how time goes, we'll have a discussion of the document that I gave you or listed on the bibliography, so I hope that you've had time to print it out. And secondly, if you've printed it out, I hope you've had time to read it, okay? Because I don't want to hear just my voice discussing the Cáin Adomnáin for 20 minutes or so. Anyway, first, let's have a look at Christianity in Ireland. In general, the biggest name in Irish Christianity historically is what? Who is the most famous saint of Ireland? Patrick, okay, who, I should add, was not Irish, but in fact was British. But here he is up here, okay, Patrick. And he is today what we might call the patron saint of Ireland, the most important saint. And in the Middle Ages, his church, Armagh, as it's pronounced, which is here, okay, was, or at least claimed to be, the most important, most powerful church in Ireland, in a similar way that Canterbury in the south of England was trying to establish itself as the primary or primate church in England and beyond, of course. So he's the big name. But like a lot of things in Irish history, it's not so simple. There's actually a lot more going on behind the scenes. And we should stress from the start, we mentioned this word, I think, last week. Hagiography is what? The lives of the saints and so on. These survive from the Middle Ages and other periods, and not just from Britain, other parts of the Christian world. We call it hagiography. They're usually written kind of later, often centuries later than the saint himself. They claim to tell us what the saint did, okay? But in fact, they tell us a lot more about the saint's church or churches during the time when it was written down. So they're trying to present their saint in one way or the other and give him certain powers or influences or something. And what that tells us is what powers they wanted to have. It may tell us nothing about the saint, him or herself, okay? So using saints' lives and similar ecclesiastical documents from the early period can be quite dangerous. And a lot of what we know about Patrick comes from Armagh and is hagiographical and of a similar nature, and it tells us a lot about what Armagh was trying to do. It may not tell us very much about the man Patrick, okay? Anyway, as a background, make a few general points first. Ireland, as we've said before, was not formally part of the Roman Empire, so it was not part of the Roman Christian world as we've been discussing and describing so far. But we have evidence that at least by the 5th century, perhaps at some point by about 430 AD, there were some Christians living in Ireland. We don't know much about these people, but there was some kind of Christianity. Ireland itself was probably still mostly pagan, but there were some people who were Christians in Ireland. We know this because in 431, I'll mention this again soon, the Pope at that time decided to send someone to Ireland. We have an account of this, which I'll describe in a bit more detail. And he said, I'm sending this man to become the first bishop of those who believe in Christ in Ireland. So that seems to be saying there are some people who are Christians in Ireland, and we're sending someone to become their bishop. Okay, so there were some forms of Christianity in parts of Ireland at this time. The Irish, as we've seen, had been, during the late Roman period, the Irish had been settling in parts of Britain. We discussed this before, but also into parts of Wales and what we call the West Country here. At least down here, we can say people were, in one way or another, Christian. So it's possible that the Irish communities that came this way, especially, maybe even the ones up here, okay, some of them went back, they maybe became Christian, some of them here, then they went back to Ireland and introduced Christianity to some of their relatives or something like that. And in addition, of course, the Irish were attacking the British coast and capturing property, but also people, okay, catching people as hostages, as slaves, captives, and so on. This is what happens to Patrick, in fact, as we shall see. So British Christians from all the way down the west coast of Britain, in relatively large numbers, were being taken to Ireland at various points in the late Roman period, because, as we've seen, British defences, the Roman defences in Britain, were weakening as the Roman forces left, and so there was not much to protect people in that sense. So for various possible reasons, and also perhaps parts of Southern Ireland had contact with Northern Gaul, what's now France as well, okay, for various reasons of contact, of trade, of catching people, and of settlement, they had contact. They were not completely isolated, and so Christianity may have been introduced by a few people on a fairly small scale, okay. And these are the people that, around this time in 431, we are told this guy is sent. So there was some Christianity, but not on a large scale. So, 431, a man called Pelagius was sent by the Pope Celestine to become this bishop for the people believing in Christ in Ireland. We have an account of this by a man called Prosper of Aquitaine, who spent some time in Rome and actually, I think, met the Pope. So this might be something he's got firsthand. He's met the Pope, and the Pope is telling him all the things I've done, including maybe last year I sent a young man called Pelagius over to Ireland to try and look after the Christians there or something. But we can assume this is fairly good evidence, okay? He's had contact with the man who's instrumental in this, okay? So according to this chronicle by Prosper of Aquitaine, in the year 431, this guy called Pelagius is sent by the Pope to look after the Christians in Ireland. And he mentions a similar statement in one of his other books, one of his other texts as well, about how the Pope Celestine had converted or Christianized Ireland, which is an exaggeration. It doesn't mean in a single go the whole of Ireland becomes Christian, but that's a way of kind of phrasing it. And you could or could not compare, of course, all this to Gregory the Great's mission that he sends to England, which of course begins just in Kent, as we discussed last week. Again, it's a papal thing. But primarily, all we have about this mission from the Pope is the account given by Prosper. It doesn't really occur elsewhere. It appears briefly mentioned in some annals, but probably Irish annals, it's probably taken from Prosper. But we don't have separate accounts of what goes on. We don't have other references to Pelagius. We don't have, I don't know, an inscription surviving from the 5th century with Pelagius' name on it. This is basically all we have. So it's rather odd that this seemingly quite important thing coming from the papacy more or less disappears as a result of a number of factors, but primarily we suspect because the guys at Armagh wanted to stress Patrick, so they're removing references to anything which might undermine the role of Patrick as converter of the Irish. So let's turn to Patrick himself now. Here we are lucky and unlucky that we actually have some writings by St. Patrick that survive. Okay, he's written what's called, usually in English, his confessions, a sort of vague account of his life and his ideas and so on, and a letter sometimes called an epistle. Religious letters are sometimes called epistles. Okay, it can be just a letter which he writes to the soldiers, the milites, of some kind of ruler called Coroticus in Britain. So we can learn something about his life on a very, very basic level from these two things that he's written himself. And then later on, we have the growing amount of hagiography and other things emerging from Armagh, okay? Particularly by the 7th, 8th, 9th century, these things are growing and so on. These are more difficult to use because already we're becoming suspicious of what the writings are meant to be saying. But the letter and the epistle and the confessions are therefore almost unique insofar as someone from the early Middle Ages is giving his account of his own deeds, and it's an important person as well. Butchin, are you checking your messages there, or no, okay. So what does he tell us about himself? Ignoring the hagiography, what can we actually say about Patrick? I'll write a few points up. He tells us his father was called Calpurnius, sometimes Calpornius, I think with an O, and his father was a deacon, a kind of religious office, and sometimes said to be a decurio. I'm not sure that's in the text as well, which is a kind of an official. And his father was called Potitus, okay, and he had been a priest. Patrick says he comes from a place called Banavem Tabernii, and no one has successfully located where this place is. It doesn't survive as a modern name successfully. But given that Patrick himself, we focus right up in the northeastern parts of Ireland, it seems likely, but it's beyond absolute proof, that somewhere up in the northern parts of England and the west area there, perhaps. So not necessarily down here in Wales or the southwest, but in the northern parts of Britain is where he comes from. His family seems to have been quite well off, and they had a small estate nearby, and Irish pirates attacked this estate, captured Patrick, and he says thousands of other people, and brought them to Ireland as slaves. Okay, they captured them, brought them as slaves, and this is what happens to him. So at some point, but we don't know exactly when, but in the 5th century perhaps, Irish ships or whatever raiders come over this way, and they capture these people, including the young teenage Patrick, and bring him over to Ireland in this direction. Eventually, Patrick was able to escape from Ireland and return to his family back to Britain. But after a few years, he has a kind of vision, like a dream, religious dream, a vision, which he says tells him to go back, encourages him to go back to Ireland to try and spread Christianity, okay, amongst the people who had captured him before. And that's what he does. So then, without any support from the church, it's nothing coming from the Pope or from British bishops, he goes back to Ireland and tries to spread Christianity. And it tells us all about it explains how he does this and so on, up to a point. And this is more or less what we've got about Patrick. He mentions a few names, places and people, but not much. He doesn't give us any definite dates, so we don't know definitely when he was active or whatever, okay? And he doesn't tell us a lot more detail about the places in Ireland he was active. But given that his main church was in Armagh, people assume he was working primarily up in the north and in the northeast, which is why his name is up here, okay? The later hagiography tell how Patrick was moving around the whole of Ireland, meeting different great kings and converting them to Christianity, but this is possibly and probably untrue. Okay? This is again what the hagiography is all about. Patrick is our guy from Armagh, but he's meant to be converting all the kings, even down in Munster and elsewhere, okay, in order that we, the Church of Armagh, can claim to be the most powerful church over the churches of Munster. But it may have nothing to do with what Patrick himself did. Okay? He doesn't say, I went to every part of Ireland or something like that and met all the kings. He doesn't claim that himself. This is something we get in the hagiography. So, that's more or less it. This is what we can say about Patrick himself. So we have a number of problems. We have Patrick, possibly active in the northern area unofficially, okay, and later on becoming more important for the Irish. He makes no reference to Pelagius. He makes no reference as such to Irish Christians and things like that. And then the accounts we have of the Pelagian mission make no reference to Patrick or whatever, though perhaps if he had been living before Pelagius, he may or may not have been responsible for those Christians that Prosper mentioned. So we're not very sure. Okay? We have this date for Pelagius. For Patrick, but it's not reliable, according to the annals, they say he came to Ireland to make the conversions in 432, and there are various dates for when he died, but one of the dates that's often given is 493. But both of these dates are probably very unreliable. We can't trust these things. Okay? They're not things which we can give much credence to. So he doesn't give dates, and the annals give inaccurate dates. So where it all fits in, I mean, maybe Pelagius was active. Presumably Pelagius would have come in from this side, from the east, from the south and the east side, whereas we're thinking Patrick was in the north, so maybe they just didn't encounter each other. They're groups of Christians. Who knows what's going on? But unfortunately, because of the Church of Armagh in the 8th and 9th centuries, the story has become somewhat different, somewhat changed. In addition, however, there are a number of other pointers which can tell us a bit about the development of Christianity in Ireland during this period. For example, as you can see on this map, there are a couple of saints. They have, or they clearly had, Christian non-Irish names, Secundinus and Auxilius. Okay, they could have been British, they could have come from the continent. Now, according to the Armagh hagiography, these guys were disciples of Patrick. A disciple is what? What do we understand by that word? English word. Yeah, yes, but usually used in a religious sense. Okay, so it's a follower or someone who's studying with someone, but in this case we could say in a more religious sense, of course, and the most famous disciples are the disciples of Jesus Christ as given in the Bible and so on. So these guys are presented in the hagiography of Armagh as followers of Patrick. But if, as people suggest, Patrick was really on his own and active up in the north, these guys quite a long way away, down here in the Midlands of Ireland, Meath and northern Leinster as it was. So it's possible that they were independent, had nothing to do with Patrick, but that the Armagh writers have kind of taken them into the Patrick story as they're slowly spreading their power and their claim to power over the other churches of Ireland. So some people have suggested that these were independent, maybe continental missionaries who came to Ireland. Others have suggested that maybe they were part of Pelagius's mission. Okay, they have perfectly good names to be part of that mission that left and were active in that area. Of course, we don't know. We have no way of being certain about this. There are churches that have their names in these areas, so we think they were active around here, but that's about as far as we can go. But they must have been some kind of early missionaries who were working in Ireland. Exactly who they were is not clear, but it shows missionary work going on. And during the 6th century, we see a growing number of Irish missionaries, holy men who were trying to spread Christianity, who were from Ireland originally themselves. And some of their names are the ones I haven't underlined on this diagram. Okay, Tiernach in the north, Kieran, a couple of Kierans, Alvi and Declan down there in the east of Munster, and so on. And these people were early, probably fairly early Christians who were setting up themselves. Again, what happens with them is hard to say because they all have their own saints' lives written later on, but we can say something perhaps about their activity and their attempts to spread Christianity and so on. Whether they were interacting with the Patrick lot, the Pelagius lot, some of them are said to have had connections with Britain. Again, in Hagiography it says they were studying with British holy men and so on, which may or may not have some truth, we don't know. But the spread of Christianity then perhaps beginning in the 5th century in Ireland, but a confusing story. Pelagius' mission, Patrick, what he's doing, it's not very clear. Then during the 6th century we see it spreading perhaps with Irish saints or holy men doing the work and so on. And only really by the 7th century do we get a very clear picture of Christianity in Ireland, which is reflected in this map. Let's try and get it all on. These are monastic sites, churches that were at least later on monastic sites, okay, which came into existence probably between 550 and 650. Okay, and we can see here the spread of Christianity. There is quite a lot of sites down here, a certain amount up here. Okay, a lot of Connaught is relatively not occupied and a bit thinner down the ground, perhaps in Munster. So we see a kind of shift in this kind of direction and so on, perhaps, interestingly enough. But what we see then by the 7th century is that Ireland was dominated by monasteries. What is a monastery? What do we call a monastery? What kind of church is a monastery?
Monks.
Sorry?
Monks.
Right, who are monks?
The people who left the urban centers for more of like a secluded life of studying religion. They originally were more hermits and then they banded together into communities.
Okay, they're people who've dedicated their lives to a religious life, in this case Christianity. We use the word monk also for like Buddhists and things, but here we're talking about Christianity. It's a community of these people, as Hassan said, monks, okay, usually one sex, in this case men, okay. Nuns is the word for similar communities of women, except they can't do all the things that men are allowed to do. And we can see this patchwork of monasteries throughout Ireland reflecting the growth and spread of this monastic idea, okay. And above them was an abbot who was the kind of boss or patron and was the sort of public spokesperson for these. And abbots are mentioned quite frequently in the annals, in Irish annals. And the strange thing that we see later in the Middle Ages, the later early Middle Ages for Ireland, is that many, we don't know about all of them, but many of them begin to form like families. Okay, or we can talk about almost dynasties of monks. Technically, of course, because they were dedicated to a Christian religious life, they were not supposed to have children. They could not get married and have sons and daughters. But it seems plenty of Irish abbots did just that, and then they were succeeded as abbot by their son or by their brother's son, and we can reconstruct the family tree a bit like the trees of kings and so on as well. And many of these religious or ecclesiastical monastic dynasties were related to the main political dynasties of the kingdoms as well. So the kinship structure of Irish politics we find creeping in some areas at least, into the way that ecclesiastical politics is organised. Okay, that was a very brief survey. Any questions? Anything not clear? Fatih? Columba was an Irish ecclesiastic who founded, most significantly, the Church of Iona, which is in Scottish Dalriata here, so outside of Ireland, okay? And Iona becomes very important because it's not only part of the kind of Irish system, but it's part of the spreading system of Scottish, Gaelic Scottish territory and so on. It has also ties to Northern England, but it's a very, very powerful and important church, okay? And the Adamnan that we shall read about and talk about shortly was a later abbot of Iona, okay? And Columba was also, he had churches in what's now Ireland as well, okay, later on, churches founded there and so on. So he's the founder of one of the most important churches, one of the most important monasteries in the Irish-Scottish world in that sense. Not to be confused with Columbanus, who was another Irishman, but he was active in what's now France, in Gaul, very famous for spreading Christianity in parts of the Frankish lands. Any other questions? Okay, so my question to you is, has anyone printed and read the Cáin Adomnáin that I asked you to print out and read for today? Jengi's looking a bit embarrassed because he didn't want to be like the only one. They're all going to say, oh, what a swat or something. A few others got the text. I'm asking this not to embarrass those who haven't. Well, partly to embarrass those who haven't, but also because if I'm going to stand here asking questions like, what does it say and what do you think, and everyone does this, then obviously it defeats the object. But some of you have printed the text and have brought it along and hopefully have had a go at reading, but it looks like the majority of you have not. Is that the case? Okay. Please, in future, when I give you the reading assignment, bear the point in mind that participation in the class will be partly determined by your participation in the discussion of the texts, as I explained in the first class. And if you haven't read the text, then you can't tell me about your ideas about the text, which means you can't participate in the discussion, blah, blah, blah. So, though printing out lots more paper is bad for the Amazon rainforests and so on, it is part of the objectives of the course.
That's not an excuse, of course, but we generally examine the text in the first place, so there is a kind of dates.
Nice try, but we examine the thing at some point. And I don't know what we did last Thursday. Last Thursday we did Irish stuff, so we didn't read a text. The previous Tuesday, a week ago, we probably discussed, what was the one we did for early England? Your memory is worse than mine. I can't really cast my mind back to what we were looking at. Bede's Ecclesiastical History, which actually may well have been the previous week. It seems a long time ago, but I think it in fact was this time last week because we did a religious stuff and things like that. But anyway, yeah, nice try, Fatty. That's a good go. Okay, but for next time, you shall all read whatever it is that I'll ask you to read, or I'll provide you with if it's not an online source for the Vikings and so on. Okay. What we have then, some of us at least, let me clean the board. Is a text called Cáin Adomnáin. Okay, the there. This is the way we pronounce, or one way of pronouncing these things in Old Irish. It's an interesting document. It's, on the one hand, a kind of law, but it also has stories and narratives and things like that. So it's an example of kind of Old Irish writing and stories, but also it's a very important religious text. As it stands, the text that we have here, okay, was probably created in the 9th century, in the 800s sometime. Okay, so not earlier, but it takes various bits of documents which may have been earlier. So it's a compilation of things put together in the 9th century. Allegedly, according to the Irish annals, in the year 697, Adamnan, who was abbot of Iona, okay, successor to Columba, promulgated, made, established something which there is called the Lex Innocentium, the law of the innocents, okay, the innocent ones, something like that. And we're usually saying Cáin Adomnáin, as we have it, is connected, or is more or less the same thing as this Lex Innocentium, which he's meant to have done. We have a number of other documents called Cain, which means a number of things: promulgated, made law. It can also refer to the payments that people have to make. And many of the cana, in the plural, are connected to particular saints, and they have a particular theme, a particular focus. Okay, so don't kill religious people is one, for example. Don't steal cows is another one. And what's the main theme of the Cáin Adomnáin? What's the main, not the only theme, but what's the predominant theme of this text? Yeah, it's protecting women. Okay. Yes. And children. And who else? There's 3 groups primarily who are protected by this law. No, they count as women in this case. So yeah, someone was saying clergy, okay, clerics, clergy. Sometimes we can put them all together and say it's a law protecting non-combatants, people who are not actively involved in fighting battles and wars and so on. So men who are not part of the church are combatants. They are likely at some point to get involved in fighting in violence, whether organised or not. And it's saying women shouldn't be doing that because of their gender, is that window banging? And children obviously should not be involved in violence. And clergy should not be involved. They should be busy praying in the churches. Though we have lots of references in Irish annals to clergymen fighting each other and fighting others, so they didn't avoid fighting too much. So these are the innocents, okay, the ones who should not be involved in fighting, and the law is then established to protect them. For those who've read it, what's the background to the Adamnain's decision to make this law, this Cain? Well, I thought you hadn't read it or something.
Yes, I remember.
Or are you psychic and you're reading other people's brains?
I've generally read it.
Right, okay, good girl, all right, okay. So yeah, okay. One version, one background is this rather strange story about his mother. Can you say a bit more about it? Remember anything more about it?
I think the mother was giving advices and some lessons to his son, how he should he should treat the women and protect them. And
Yeah, okay, all right, yeah. Cengiz, do you want to add to this?
She's kind of giving examples to him of why they should treat women good because of the fact that they bear the children and they take care of them and they play this role even though they're not considered as men's equals, but all men come of a woman. So for that reason,
Yes, I mean, you could all...
legendary elements.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's what we're trying to get at. I mean, there's... no, I haven't got time to read. Okay, at the beginning it opens, before we get to Adamnan and his mum, we've got this rather nasty, set out as paragraph 2, the way that Kunar Meyer has edited it here. Okay, Coverlach, which means female slave or bondmaid, was a name for woman till Adamnan came to free them. Okay, so women were just called servants or slaves or something. And this was the Coverlach, a woman for whom a hole was dug at the end of the door so that it came up over her nakedness. So they're putting these scantily clad women in holes. The end of the great spit, which is a long stick that you might cook animals on, was placed upon her till the cooking of the portion was ended. After she had come out of the earth pit, she had to dip a candle 4 men's hands in length in a plate of butter and lard, and that candle to be on her palm, obviously very hot, until division of the food and distribution of the liquor and making of beds and in the houses of the kings, blah, blah, it carries on. Okay? But it presents this rather nasty position of the way women were treated in pre-Adamnan, pre-697 Irish society. Now, firstly, of course, that's probably not entirely true. It's an exaggeration, but it's presenting this kind of negative picture of the way that women were downtrodden and so on and things like that. But it sets the scene. Okay, and then it talks about their situation where they have to go out into battles and things like that. And one of the great things men could take away from a battle is to cut off a woman's head and say, I've got a woman's head, or cut off her breasts, okay, even worse, and things like that. I mean, it leaves you kind of feeling, oh, horrible, these guys, early Irish guys were terrible and things like that, and the feminist inside you getting very angry. But it's probably a great exaggeration, okay, because it's trying to make a certain point. Then we get this story of Adamnan and his mother going along, and I think they're going across some difficult land or something, and he says, okay, Mum, let me carry you a little bit here because the land isn't very good, carry on my back or something. And she says, no, you're not going to do that, you're no son of mine, you're worthless son. He says, what are you talking about? I'm a good boy, Mum, and things like this. And she says, no, until you save all the women and things, then you're no son of mine. And then we get this story, I can't remember the details, but all these kind of horrible things happen to him, and he's buried and all sorts of stuff until finally he can kind of make his law. Okay, that's one obviously very legendary, and we don't believe that. We don't think these things actually happened to Adamnan. I'm sure he spent most of his time in Iona working his way up the hierarchy to become abbot of the church and so on. There's a second account, a second version, which seems to suggest slightly different background, equally legendary. Okay, what's the second version of this? It's later on. Can anyone remember, those of you who read this? Have you got numeration? Has anyone got the text here? Yeah, okay. Marta, have you got the text? Does it have the numbers 33. Maybe it's 33. Because I think you've just got a scanned version of the same text that I've got the photocopy of. It says, after 14 years, Adamnan obtained his law of God, and this is the cause. On Pentecost Eve, a holy angel of the Lord came to him, and again on Pentecost Eve after a year, and seized the staff and struck his side and said to him, go forth into Ireland and make a law in that women be not in any manner killed by men through slaughter or any other death, either by poison or in water or in fire, and blah, 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 blah. Okay? So this seems to me, anyway, as if there's two different versions of this origin story for the law. One, which everyone can kind of relate to, is their mum one, okay? And the second one is a more formal one of the angel coming to this religious man, presumably in his church, and then giving him this message. Okay, and a very common biblical theme of the angels coming and telling people what's going to happen or what they should do and things like that. So probably there were a number of different accounts, number of different stories of how the law of Adamnan, the Lex Innocentium, came about. And someone's put at least two of these versions together and mixed them up in this text. So you've got to read it as a composite thing. That's what I think is going on. Oh, okay, we don't have a lot of time. What kind of things are they protecting? We've said about the women and so on, but what aspects of women and of the others are being protected here? What?
Property rights. Kind of property rights were trying to be protected, as far as I remember.
You might be right, I can't remember all the details. I think some aspects of the property of the church, maybe, you can't damage.
After
They split the household that their husband had passed. You mentioned something about that.
Right, okay, yes, that rings a bell.
But also just about the treatment as far as with the women, like not to beat them, not to rape them, and then for everything there's punishments.
Yeah, there's payments and so on, and there's certain compensation payments, okay? It even uses the word eric, which is the kind of compensation payment, or one of the words for this kind of payment in early Irish law and so on. So it overlaps with the Irish system, what we discussed last week, okay, where the family members are the ones who kind of keep people under control, and any crimes or whatever are sorted out between families to avoid too much going on. And that's the customary law. Yes, so killing, violence without killing, rape, other sexual abuse, even just kind of questioning a lady's reputation and saying, are those children really yours, or who's the father of those children, and things like that. That was also, again, not a physical thing, but a reputation thing, being looked after and so on. And for the clergy and the children, again, not so much detail, but again, as non-combatants, there are punishments and so on for killing children and clergymen, and to some extent protection of church property and so on, and things like that. It works, as it said, with the idea of compensation. You have to pay a certain amount ultimately to the church of Adamnan, of course, so he's the one who's kind of controlling this. But interestingly enough, because it's a religious law as well, it also talks about penance. What is penance? Anyone know that? No.
I always viewed it as like they were saying, like, for this amount of time you have to pray and do these things in order to be like brought back into the fold.
Yeah. It's maybe again. Hassan was saying punishment. You could kind of call it a punishment. It's kind of religious punishment for a sin or a crime and so on. I'm not sure exactly what people were expected to do here, and it's probably very different from the kind of penitential things that people do today in the Catholic or other churches and so on. But at the most kind of basic level, you have to repeat certain prayers X number of times a day and things like this or whatever. But there are probably other rather more stressful or arduous demands that were expected to be done over a certain period of time. So they're taking elements of the kind of native law, the system of compensation payment to family, but the main concern here is to the church, of course. And in addition, they have what you might call religious sanction or punishment for these things as well. So this law kind of stretches across the divide between, if there is a divide, between the kind of secular world in early Ireland and the religious world, which we can see active there as well. The big question, I suppose, is what we can use it for, okay? How much of this can we use to tell us about the end of the 7th century and Adamnan himself, and how much of it tells us a little bit more about the perspectives of a few hundred years later when the actual documents we have were put together. A lot of the legendary stuff and so on has probably been building up over the centuries, but some of the parts, the most boring bits, you probably saw long lists of names of kings, okay, which you didn't bother to read. Now that's the kind of thing that would excite me, okay, and people have written, I know someone has written a whole article just about those names to try and prove the authenticity and so on and things like that. So it's a mixture of these things, and again with lots of medieval sources, early medieval sources, you have to kind of be very careful sifting, trying to work out the reliability and so on. But it gives us some picture of how things may have worked. Now, the big problem with laws as historical sources is they tell us what someone thought. I'm going to make a law, but it doesn't really tell us necessarily if the law was put into effect. If I said, okay, from now on in the rest of this course, I may have made this joke last year, I don't remember, in the prep year class. If I said that now the law, Lex Davidi, is that everyone must wear a hat when they come into my class, little hat or something, you know, okay? Now, most of you would think, well, I'm not going to wear a hat. Has he gone mad? So you'd all come without wearing the hat. But if the document was found in 300 years' time, saying, this is the law of David the teacher, everyone must wear a hat or something. Now, how would an historian approach that? Would they say, everyone wore hats in Bilkent in the year 2009? Or would they say, the man who made this law was a bit crazy, or whatever, or was there somewhere in between the two? And that's the problem we have on a bit bigger, more serious scale when we look at medieval, early medieval laws especially. How much of it actually worked, okay? How much of this, to what extent did this law, and some of it must reflect the real law that was promulgated at some point around then, how much of it actually worked, okay? Now I've mentioned already that we've got plenty of references to clergymen fighting each other and so on during the early Middle Ages, so they were not always non-combatants and things like that. And with any law, it's how can you enforce it rather than what it says. It tells us something, but it doesn't necessarily tell us about the actual workings of society. And to what extent can, I don't know, the abbots of Iona or elsewhere, Raphoe and elsewhere, actually kind of control activity throughout Ireland in a period when they didn't have modern communication and things like that. So this tells us more about ideas and perhaps less about physical reality on a day-to-day basis. Okay, I can see on my watches we're coming up to past, so let's stop there. As I said, apologies for failing to bring the bibliography. I shall send the material to you by email tomorrow, and if there's any reading material, I'll bring it on Thursday. And editor and I need to talk either face-to-face or by email to sort of discuss what she wants to do and so on, because obviously Thursday we're beginning Vikings and I need to know what I'm doing so we don't overlap too much, okay? Okay, thank you very much. See you all on Thursday.